We're now on Daf Nun Aleph Amud Beis, and we're talking about a Tinok Ben Yom Echad in a brisa that records a 1-day-old infant mitame beziva. If a 1-day-old baby, newborn, has an emission of ziva, which would be in the case of a male, a seminal discharge. And again, it's different from regular semen in its texture and color. So that's called ziva. And a woman also could have a ziva on the very day of her birth, a newborn babe. And the halacha is that through this ziva, we have tumah ziva. Or if it's a seminal discharge, it would be a balkari. But here he's tameh b'tumah ziva. Now the halacha is that if a male has 2 consecutive days of discharges of ziva on day 1, ziva on day 2, or he has a ziva in bein hashmoshos that spans 2 days, then he's considered a zav. And tumas zav is more chomer than tumas balkeri. So, for example, Rabbosai, there's a whole issue today. I don't know if you're up on it about whether you're allowed to go onto the Har Bayis or not. And a zav is excluded from Machna Leviyah. So a Tummy mess is only excluded from Machna Yisrael. So he could right. He could be careful not to go beyond into. I'm sorry. A Tummy mess is excluded from Machna Shechina. So he could be very careful. He doesn't go anywhere near the Machna Shechina. But if he ends up in the Machna Leviyah and he's a Zav, I mean, that's a problem. It's not a Chi of Karis, but it's a Chi of Lav. Anyway. So even a newborn male infant can contract the tumah of ziva if he experiences 2 zivos. If you're going to tell me that as a result of the trauma of passing through the very narrow birth canal, there's a concussion of the limbs, ikri kan mibsaro v'lo machmas onso. When we talk about tumas ziva, we have a drasha that tells me that tumas ziva does not apply in the case of machmas onso. And therefore, we would attribute the newborn's omission of ziva to a concussion of the limbs, and that is considered machmas onso. So how can the Brisa say that this newborn babe is metami tumas ziva? It must be that Rav Nachman is correct that the delivery of the newborn babe does not create any concussion of the limbs, because if it created a concussion of the limbs as a result of the birth of the delivery, then it would not become Tomei B'Tumas Ziva. And that's based on the principle Lo Machmas Onso. Gemara rejects Rov. No proof. Hachamai Askinon, I'm going to give you a case where it's such an unusual type of birth that we have every reason to assume that the ziva would not be a metame. But if it would have been a normal birth, then the ziva would be metame. Kigon sheyotza derech dofen. Okay, so derech dofen is called cesarean. So therefore, if it went out through cesarean, right, there was a surgical operation, and therefore there was no yitzia through a narrow base of rechem. And in this case, therefore, we cannot attribute the ziva to the trauma of childbirth, And that's why the child is Tamei Tumas Ziva. But Enochinami, in a normal birth, we would assume that there's no Tumas Ziva. Why? Because it's Machmas Onso. The trauma of the birth is what brought about this Ziva situation. Toshma, Egel Shenolad Biyontif, Shochatin Oso Biyontif. Right? If a newborn calf is shechted on Yontif, that's perfectly permissible, even on the day of its birth. And it would seem that that would support Rav Nachman that a newborn animal can be slaughtered. We don't have to wait the 24 hours, and we don't assume that it had some sort of concussion as a result of the birth process. Gemara says no. Maybe the Bryce is dealing with a case where the animal that's born did not undergo the trauma of normal birth. It was a cesarean. And that's why you're allowed to shecht it without waiting the 24 hours to see whether or not it has some sort of concussion. And a third time, Toshma, Vishavin She'im Nolad Hu Umumo Imo, Shezeh Min HaMuchan. We're talking now about the law of Bechor, and we're talking about a balmum, a blemish. And now we're talking about a newborn baby animal. That was a Bechor, Peter Rechem Li'imo. And guess what? It has a blemish. Now, the halacha is that a Bechor has to be brought on the Mizbeach. So therefore you would not shecht it on Yontif. But if the Bechor is in fact a balmum, then you're allowed to eat it. And on Yontif, therefore you're allowed to shecht it. And we're assuming that this animal is not muktzah, but rather it's zeb min hamuchan. Because we say that if the animal is born as a balmum, then this mum happened to the animal who knows when, and you could therefore shecht it on the day of its birth on Yontif. So why not give the same answer that we gave over and over again? If the animal did not experience the trauma of going through the very narrow birth canal because it had a cesarean, then we know that the animal is prepared, it's muchan, it's not muktzah, and we can shecht it. But if it came through a normal birth, then it could be that this blemish was not min hamuchan, and the animal was already royal shchita from its lifetime, but rather it came through the result of the birth of the animal. And therefore the birth of the animal caused this concussion. The animal is a treifa, and enochinami, in such a case, you would not be allowed to shecht it on Yontif. So the Gemara says, derech dofen mikadosh. We're talking here about Kedushas Bechor, and we're vacillating back and forth, are you allowed to shecht it or not? Obviously, it has Kedushas Bechor, but if it's a cesarean birth, then it doesn't have Kedushas Bechor, because we have a statement of Rabbi Yochanan in the name of Rabbi Shimon, Le'inyan Kodshim Eino Kadosh, that as far as bringing a carbon from a Bechor that was a cesarean birth, right, derech dofen, then you cannot bring it as a carbon. So a Bechor that was born by cesarean birth does not have Kedushas Bechor, and it cannot be brought in a carbon. And yet, the Brisa says we're going to permit this Bechor in Yontif because it had a permanent blemish before it was born, and therefore it doesn't have Kedushas Bechar, but otherwise it would have had Kedushas Bechar. Obviously, we're talking about a natural birth. It cannot be a cesarean birth because then it couldn't have Kedushas Bechar. And the Gemara rejects it. We have a proof that this animal did not suffer a concoction. Why? Because the newborn planted its hooves on the ground. Rav Nachman ruled that an animal that was slaughtered, even on the day of its birth, even if it didn't plant its hooves on the ground, so that's not going to bring a proof for Rav Nachman, because only in this case we have a proof that it didn't suffer a concoction. Another ruling of Rav Nachman, Beis HaMitbachayim, right? So that's like the slaughterhouse. Beis HaMitbachayim, but that's where they take the limbs of the animal and they prepare it. Ein bo mishum risuk aivar. So what are we talking about? When a shochet comes to shecht an animal, he's got to slam the animal, so to speak, down on the ground. And you might think that that action of the butcher would itself prove or establish that there's a concussion in the limbs. Comes along Rav Nachman, he says, when the butcher throws down the animal, wrestles it down to the ground, that doesn't engender a concussion of the limbs. And therefore we understand the following story. Hahu Torah, as we said many times, Torah is an ox, did nafal and it fell. V'ishtama kol nigi choseha. And we hear the groans of the animal. So again, we're talking about an ox that fell. Now, how did it fall? It's in the Beis HaMitbachayim, right? It's in the shechting house. So the shochet threw the animal down. So the animal fell. And you hear the animal groaning. Then the shochet went ahead and he shechted the animal immediately. Al Rav Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta v'shakel mishufrei de. Rav Yitzchak went ahead and he bought the best meat from this animal. Amri le Rav Hana minolacha. How do you know that this animal that was felled, if you make a verb out of the word fell, did not sustain some sort of a concussion? Amalahu hachi amarav tziparnov noetz ad shemagila aretz. Right, the animal has a certain sixth sense, so to speak, and it intuitively knows that it's being felled for shechita. So it digs its hooves into the ground until it reaches the ground, and that's going to avoid any sort of trephus. If after the animal fell down from 10 tvachim high, it stood up on its feet. We don't have to wait to see in the next 24 hours how the animal fares. If it was able to stand up, that is proof positive that it did not suffer risuk eivar. And bedika vari boy, but at least we have to examine after the shechita the internal organs to make sure 100% that no trephus was caused by the fall. However, the Gemara says that's not how we paskin, but rather halacha eina tzricha b'dika. She doesn't even need any sort of examination. We assume the animal sustained no fatal injury from the fall, because the animal stood up. However, Abchia bar Ashi Omar, he disagrees. Achazu v'achazu tzricha b'dika. Whether the animal walks normally or it does not, you have to examine to make sure that there's no treifa. Omar Rab Yirmiyah bar Acha, Omar Rav, Pashta Yoda La'amod. I don't even have to wait until the animal stands up or takes a walk. All I need to see is that the animal stretches out its foreleg in an attempt to stand up, even though Lo Omdo did not successfully do so. It's considered when it extends its foreleg to have stood up. Akar Agleha, I'm going to go even a step further. Not only in a case where it stretched out its foreleg, but even in a case where it raised its hind leg in an attempt to walk, it's not a treif. Rav Acha Omar, Niara Lamod Afal Pishlo Amta. I don't even need akar ragla. I don't even need that it raised its hind leg in an attempt to walk. Forget about that. All I need is that it stirred itself up to stand up. It never actually stood up. But we know it's not a treif. Hecha did nafla min agag bidalo yada. In other words, the animal fell off the gag not intentionally. The umda v'lo holcha. It stood up, but it didn't walk. Tzricha b'dika. We have to check out the internal organs. V'ena tzricha meis le'es. We don't have to wait 24 hours before the shechita. V'im holcha afilu b'dika nami lo tzricha. So if it's nafla below yada, amda v'lo holcha, tzricha b'dika. But if it's holcha, so again, we're going stage by stage. One stage is amda v'lo holcha. In that case, you need a bedika of 24 hours. Then we have a case where it did something even more profound, and that is holcha. Doesn't need a bedika at all. Omar, maybe Shmei Rav Dimi Minardoi Nefula, an animal that fell, Shamru Tzricha Bedika, and we said it needs an examination. Keneged B'nei Hame'ayin, along the length of the B'nei Me'ayin. All right, these are the stomachs and so forth and so on. Amalei Marzutra, Hochi Amrina Mishmei Rav Papa, Tzricha Bedika Keneged Beis Hachol Kulo. It's not enough to check out the animal in its stomach, but you also require a more extensive, profound examination, the entire trunk of the body. The trunk houses the internal cavity. The ribs and the spinal column must be examined for the possibility of signs of treif. Rav Huna, Mar Bar Braid, Rav Nechemia, Rav Ashi, Simonim Mai. Do we assume that this nefula may have completely dislocated its simonim, the kana and the veshet? And therefore we'd have to require an examination of the kana veshet before we determine that the animal is kosher. Amalei simonim kashim hein eitzel nefila. You don't have to worry about the dislocation of the kana and the veshet as a result of the nefila, because we assume that the simonim kashin hein. They're tough. So no examination is required. Okay, now we get to birds. Falling birds. Omer Rabbi Yehuda Omer Shmuel, Of shenechbad al pnei hamayim. The bird was thrown up against the surface of the water, kevin sheshot, but now it's swimming. Melo komasa, the length of its body, that's the amount of swimming it has to do. Dayo, and we know that it did not suffer a concussion. But la amarna ella mimata lemala, the bird has to swim upstream in order to prove that it's not a treifa and it did not suffer a concussion. Avol milamalamata, but if the water is going downstream and it brings the bird from one place to another, Mayahu dash pelu. We're not going to assume that this bird was propelling itself through the water, but rather downstream movement is what projected the bird. The imaya kaima lesanba. But if you have calm waters that do not have a stream, then it matters not whether the bird swam upstream or downstream. The bird is mutter. It certainly propelled itself. V'ish da tsive v'kaidme. Okay, now what is floating on the surface of the water? In this case, there are chips of wood that are strewn around the surface of the water. If the bird swims downstream, hakadme, there's a stream, and we don't know when the bird moves with the stream, is it propelling itself, or is the downstream pushing the bird forward? The way of determining that is to see whether other objects on the surface of the river that are being pushed downstream are moving at the same pace. We're going to set up a race between the bird and the chips of wood that are being propelled to go downstream, and who gets there first. If the bird is able to propel itself at a greater speed, then it means it's not being moved by the downstream motion, but by its own inner ability to propel itself, and therefore the bird is permitted. Now, we said that the bird had fallen into water. Glima masiach chayshina. The word chayshina on him means that we have to raise a serious fear of concussion of the limbs. And why? Because glima masiach. Now, the word masiach, even in modern Hebrew, means metach. Metach means tension, meaning pulling in two different directions. So now the bird falls on a sheet, on a glima, like a cloth, and this glima was being stretched across pegs. And as a result, this glima is a very taut, tight object. And if the bird falls onto this very tight, taut object, it might have broken its limbs. But the lo masiach, if it's just a regular sheet made of cloth and it's not stretched out by, across pegs in the ground, then lo chayshina, we don't have to be concerned with the possibility that the bird would have broken its limbs due to the impact of the bird's body onto the sheet. Uf uf lo chayshina. Right? There are certain situations in which we have to assume that the sheet is not stretched and taut and tough, which would be enough to injure the bird. And that is because the sheet was folded. And the assumption is that a folded sheet cannot be stretched tautly. Isla umekarve kitre chayshina. Now, the word kitre means knots. Now, the knots are sort of like a net. And as you know, there are two types of nets. There's loose and there's tight. So the bird flies into a net, which is spread out in the air, and the knots mekarve, mekarve kitri, the kitri of the knots, and mekarve means that they are very closely and tightly spaced. And in such a case, chayshina means we have to concern ourselves with the possibility that when the bird fell onto this sheet, I have a feeling we're dealing with what's it called? Hunters. The hunters hunting down this bird. And he spreads out a net in the air, and the bird gets caught in the net. And the knots on this net are close together, and the bird may very well have concussioned its limbs because of the impact on the closely spaced knots. But loma carvi, if the knots are not so close together, kitre the knots, lo chayshin. However, now we talk about a bird falling onto various kinds of natural things that grow. Kisna is flax. The ovid betune, and they made the flax into bundles, and now they become very tight, very stiff. Chayshina, if the bird fell on top of this flax that was made into these tight bundles, then we have to be concerned with risa kaivar. The high gisa lo chayshin. This side or this side. So I guess there are two parts to the bundle here. The bundle of flax has sides and it has a peak. If the bird hits the peak, and this flax was made into bundles, the flax bundle is stiff, and we have to be choshesh li risa. But if, on the other hand, the bird strikes the bundle on the side, whether it's this side or that side, then it doesn't have that kind of an impact that's going to break and cause concussions of its limbs. Isuyasa is a bundle of reeds Chayshina. The reeds, as they're bundled up, are very tough, very tight. And the impact of the bird on these bundles of reeds will cause a concussion of its limbs. However, Kisna, the Daik Vinofitz, Lo Chayshina. So here the bird fell onto flax that was beaten and combed, and therefore it was softened. So we have a cushion, a soft flax cushion. We're not concerned that the animal may have, in this fall, broken its concussion of its limbs. But dayek velo nofitz chayshinon. If the flax was low nofitz, it wasn't yet combed, so you have this flax sort of in its natural state. Even though it was pounded, but it wasn't combed. So there are lots of hard particles in the uncombed flax. Once again, chayshina, we have to worry about the possibility that when the bird fell, it may have broken its inner limbs. The Ovid Bizre, if the bird fell on flax that was not only beaten, but it was also combed, which means that they removed all the hard particles, is then only if Ika Be Kitre Chayshinon. Only if it has these knots. Daxa Chayshinon. Now, what is Daxa? I think that Daxa is the waste material from the flax, and the flax has fibers, and these daca are coarser and chayshina. Dakta lo chayshina. All right, so now we're talking about a pile of tow, T-O-W, that's on the ground. And the assumption is that this TOW, I have to look that up, will cushion the fall of the bird. Again? He says here that dakta is finely ground flax waste. Navra, is that the word navra? Is a pile of fibers that grow around palm trees. They're very hard, chayshinon. But timachta, a pile of navra that has been cut into strips and made soft, lo chayshinon. We get the flow of it. I mean, the Gemara is gonna on the next Almud is going to create a cloud, but kitma nihila, a pile of sifted ashes. Well, I would have thought that ashes are soft, but it says chayshinon, the sifted ash hardens. Lo nihila, if he didn't do any sifting, excuse me, lo chayshinon. We're not concerned that the ashes are stiff. But let's just finish it up here on Bays. Chol hadak, if the bird fell into fine sand, lo chayshinon, But chol hagas, if it fell onto coarse sand, chayshinon. Avak drochim chayshinon. The dust on the road were concerned. Tivna v'odvid bizna. Now, tivna is Aramaic for teven, which is straw, and ovid bizna means he made it into a bundle. So a bundle of straw could be very, like a haystack, could be very tough, and therefore chayshinon. But lo ovid bizna, if the straw was not bundled, lo chayshinon. And now the Gemara is going to go on to speak about different grains, spelt, rye, wheat, barley, and so forth and so on. And then it goes on to beans, legumes, and distinguishes between certain kinds where there is chayshinon, it's very tough, and others where it's very soft and we're not choshesh for risu avonim. Okay then, so that's Daf Nun Aleph, which means that tomorrow we'll do Daf Nun Beis, and Mitzvah on Sunday we'll do Daf Nun Gimel. So let me take this opportunity to wish you a great Shabbos, and we shouldn't know from falling.